Okay, so we're really getting into the weeds with Clausewitz in this deep dive. We're tackling Book 5, Chapter 17 of On War on Country and Ground.
Yeah, this one's a favorite.
I know Clausewitz can be, well, let's just say he was a man of many words, B-U-T, this chapter.
Yeah.
This is where it gets really interesting. It's all about how the terrain itself, the land where you're fighting, can make or break a military operation.
And what's fascinating here is that Clausewitz, he goes beyond the obvious, right? He's not just saying, oh, mountains are tough to climb, so bad for armies.
He is.
He digs into how terrain changes your entire approach to warfare.
It's like terrain isn't just the setting for the battle. It's practically a character in the fight.
Exactly. It influences your tactics, the types of troops you use, even how much control a commander can realistically have over what's happening.
So it's not just about moving troops around. It's about how the terrain impacts every decision you make.
100%.
Clausewitz, he lays out these three main ways terrain impacts military operations. First up is movement. How easy is it to move across this specific terrain? Are we talking open plains or dense forests, mountains, swamps?
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Trying to pull off a rapid advance through some dense woods. Not going to be easy.
Right, like trying to maneuver artillery across a mountain range.
It's about recognizing that different terrain demands different approaches, different tactics. You've got to adapt, maybe even use different troops altogether.
Which leads right into a second point, visibility. How far can you see in this terrain? That's huge in warfare, obviously, but I feel like it's often overlooked.
Absolutely. Clausewitz knew that. He understood that in dense forests, for example, your ability to see the enemy, to even control your own troops, it's massively restricted. Completely different ballgame compared to fighting in open terrain.
And, of course, no one wants to be caught out in the open when the artillery starts flying, which brings us to Clausewitz's third point,
Yeah.
cover.
And cover, well, it all comes down to the terrain. Mountains, forests, buildings, even just the lay of the land. They all dictate how much cover is available, and that translates directly to vulnerability.
It's not as simple as mountains are good for defense, open fields are bad.
Exactly. Clausewitz is showing us how each type of terrain has its own advantages and disadvantages. It's strategic, like a game of chess where each square on the board impacts your next move.
Speaking of chess, Clausewitz then gets into how specific types of terrain, like forests, mountains, and even cultivated land, they all impact those three factors we just talked about: movement, visibility, and cover.
And this is where it gets really insightful. He argues that forests, for instance, even though they're tough to move through, they can actually simplify things strategically.
Really, I would have thought forests would make everything more chaotic, not less.
That's what's so interesting, right? You'd think that. But see, in the open, armies can spread out, try to outflank each other, all those big sweeping maneuvers. But forests, they kind of funnel troops into more predictable paths. They restrict those big flanking movements you see in open battles.
So it's like the forest itself is a bottleneck.
Exactly.
So forests, they sort of naturally funnel troops. What about mountains? I feel like Clausewitz had a lot to say about those.
He did, yeah. Mountains were a big one for him.
And it makes sense, right? Trying to move an army through those things.
And this is where his thinking on terrain and command, it gets really sharp. Like really relevant even for, modern militaries. See, mountains, they naturally force armies to divide, right? You got to navigate those passes, deal with limited visibility.
Yeah, forget about sending a radio message. You're stuck with guys on foot trying to get a message through.
Exactly. Communication becomes a nightmare. So a commander sitting miles away, he's got way less control over what's actually happening on the ground.
Which, I mean, at first glance, that sounds like a bad thing, right? Left control over your troops?
You'd think so, right? You want your troops following orders, executing the plan. But Clausewitz, he recognized that sometimes clinging to that rigid control, especially in tough terrain, it can really backfire.
So what's the alternative? Just let it all fall apart?
No, not at all. He's saying that the terrain itself, it demands a different kind of command. Decentralized command, he calls it.
So, like, the mountains themselves are saying, nope, you're going to have to trust your people on the ground a little more.
Exactly. You got it. In those environments, things can change in a heartbeat. Communication can go down, units get separated, and you need people on the ground who can think for themselves, react quickly.
It's like, imagine trying to micromanage a platoon that's navigating a firefight in some dense jungle from miles away.
Yeah, good luck with that. They need to be able to react to what's right in front of them, make decisions based on their understanding of that specific terrain in real time. Clausewitz, he understood that this wasn't a breakdown in command, it was about adaptation.
Okay, so it's less about just giving orders. and more about empowering your people to make the right call when it counts.
That's a great way to put it. It's about clear objectives, yeah, but also fostering initiative in those subordinate commanders, letting them use their judgment,
Yeah.
trusting them, basically.
And honestly, that's probably good advice for any kind of leadership, not just in the military, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is where Clausewitz goes beyond just military theory. He's getting at something fundamental about human nature, about the need to adapt, about how rigid control, it just doesn't work in complex situations.
So we've talked about forests, we've talked about mountains. Yeah. What about something like farmland, like cultivated land, fields, those kinds of areas? How does Clausewitz see that playing into things?
He calls it cultivation, and you might think, okay, fields, that's not as dramatic as mountains or forests, but it has a huge impact.
I mean, I guess a cornfield isn't exactly ideal for marching an army through, but
Yeah, exactly. It might seem open, right? But you've got ditches, fences, hedgerows, farmhouses, all these little obstacles that can really mess with a large force.
and remember what we were saying about cover. All those ditches and walls, and even the crops themselves, those provide hiding spots, opportunities for ambush. So if forests force concentration, and mountains, they force dispersion, what does cultivated land do?
It's kind of both, actually. Those obstacles, they limit large-scale maneuvers, so it pushes you towards smaller, more agile units.
But smaller units are harder to control too, right? They're constantly having to adjust to the little things, the micro-terrain, you could say.
Exactly. It's that constant push and pull, trying to maintain control while also adapting to what the terrain throws at you, which, makes you think about how terrain dictates the types of troops you can even use effectively in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense. You wouldn't send a cavalry charge through the Alps, right?
Right. Unless you got those horses some climbing gear. He's saying that terrain, it dictates your troop choices. In thick woods or mountains, cavalry, which is all about speed and maneuverability, they lose their advantage.
They're basically sitting ducks.
Pretty much. And artillery, too, as powerful as it also becomes less effective. Hard to position, lines of fire get blocked, even the impact is absorbed by the ground itself.
So who benefits from difficult terrain? If cavalry and artillery, they're kind of out of luck.
Clausewitz, he's clear on this infantry. He says in forests, mountains, or this kind of mixed cultivated terrain infantry, they have a distinct advantage.
More adaptable, they can make use of cover, they don't need that open ground.
Exactly. Even in our age of drones and missiles and all that, Clausewitz reminds us that these are fundamentals and they haven't gone anywhere. It's about understanding them, applying them to your specific situation.
Which I think brings us to one of the most interesting things Clausewitz talks about, the impact of terrain on command. Yeah. So we're talking about how the ground itself, the terrain, can actually dictate how you command your troops.
It's all connected, yeah. And this is where Clausewitz, he really gets into it. This is the kind of insight that's still so relevant today, especially for, military leaders, anyone making decisions in a chaotic environment.
Because it's not like things are usually happening on a perfectly flat, open battlefield.
Exactly. Clausewitz, he's saying that the tougher the terrain, we're talking mountains, forests, even dense urban areas, the less direct control a commander can actually have over what's happening.
Which, okay, at first that sounds like a bad thing, right? You want your troops following orders, executing the plan as intended.
Right, you'd think so. But Clausewitz recognized that clinging to that rigid control, especially when you're dealing with difficult terrain, it can actually do more harm than good.
So what, you just let it all fall apart, total chaos?
No, not at all. He's saying that the terrain itself demands a different approach to command, a more decentralized approach, where you're giving more autonomy to those on the ground.
Like the terrain itself is saying, hey, you got to trust your people on the ground a little bit here.
Exactly. You got it. Because in those environments, things can change on a dime, communication goes down, units get split up, and you need people who can think for themselves, adapt to the situation at hand.
It's like trying to micromanage a platoon that's in a firefight in some dense jungle from hundreds of miles away. It's just not going to work.
Not effectively, that's for sure. Those troops, they need to be able to react to immediate threats, make decisions based on what they're seeing, what they know about that specific piece of ground.
So it's less about giving a bunch of orders from some far-off headquarters and more about making sure your people have the ability and the trust to make the right call when it matters.
Exactly. It's about setting those clear objectives. Absolutely. But it's also about fostering initiative in your subordinate commanders, letting them use their judgment, trusting them to make those tough calls under pressure.
Which, honestly, that's good advice for any leader in any field, right? It's not always about having all the answers. Sometimes it's about empowering your people to find the solutions.
100%. This is one of those places where Clausewitz, he goes beyond just military theory. He's talking about human nature,
Hmm.
the need to adapt, to be flexible, to recognize that rigid control. It doesn't really work in the real world.
It makes me think about how much the landscape itself has dictated the course of wars throughout history. I mean, Clausewitz, he lived through some pretty massive changes in how wars were fought, right?
Absolutely. He was writing in the early 1800s, right after the Napoleonic Wars. So he saw firsthand those massive battles with huge armies on the move.
And those big Napoleonic battles, those were all about maneuver, about trying to outflank the enemy, deliver a decisive blow.
Exactly. And that kind of warfare, it works on those open battlefields, like you saw in parts of France and Germany. You can see the enemy, you can move your forces relatively easily, you can concentrate your power for that big attack. But then you look at somewhere like Spain with all those mountains, and it's a completely different story.
Yeah, the Spanish, they used guerrilla warfare against Napoleon's armies, hit-and-run tactics.
Exactly, because that kind of terrain, those mountains, they completely negate the advantages of a traditional army. It's hard to move through, easy to ambush in, almost impossible to control a large force effectively. And Clausewitz, he points out that this kind of terrain, it can actually level the playing field.
Because even a smaller force, if they know the terrain, they can use it to their advantage.
Exactly. They can make that larger, more powerful army fight on their terms.
It's not just about the types of terrain. It's about how different landscapes actually demand different ways of approaching war.
100%. And that's something that's still so relevant today, right?
Hmm.
Think about the conflicts we see around the world. Urban warfare, jungle warfare, desert warfare. Each one has its own unique challenges.
And you can't just take the same playbook you used in the mountains of Afghanistan and expect it to work in the deserts of Iraq or the streets of some city.
No way. Each terrain demands a different approach, a deep understanding of its nuances, how to use it to your advantage, and how to avoid falling prey to its dangers.
So terrain, it's not just some static background for warfare. It's this dynamic force that shapes everything. How you move your troops, how you command and control them, even the overall strategy you use to try to win the war.
Absolutely. And I think most importantly, Clausewitz is saying that if you want to be successful, you have to understand the terrain as well as you understand your own army.
It's almost like terrain is another combatant. It's throwing these unexpected things at you, forcing you to think differently.
That's a great way to put it, because it really gets at what Clausewitz was trying to emphasize throughout On War, that warfare is inherently unpredictable. You can plan and strategize all you want, but ultimately the terrain, the weather, the morale of your troops, all these things can shift the balance in a moment's notice.
So for our listeners out there, those who are preparing to lead troops in the real world, what are some of the key takeaways from Clausewitz's insights on terrain?
I think there are a few really crucial things to keep in mind. First, never underestimate the importance of terrain. Study those maps, know the key features, those choke points, the areas that offer cover and concealment, things like that. Because what might look like a minor hill on a map could be the difference between controlling the battlefield and getting outmaneuvered.
It's about knowing the ground as well as you know your enemy.
Exactly. And the second thing is, think about how the terrain is going to impact your ability to command and control your troops. Can you maintain clear lines of communication? Do you need to delegate more authority to those lower-level commanders?
Because trying to micromanage every decision when your people are spread out over miles of difficult terrain, well, that's a recipe for disaster.
100%. And finally, remember that terrain, it can be both an advantage and a disadvantage. You need to know how to use it to your benefit, but you also need to anticipate how the enemy might try to use it against you.
It's like that classic line, know your enemy and know yourself, and you need not fear the result of 100 battles. But Clausewitz is adding in there, know the ground you're fighting on too.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Because warfare, it's a contest of wills, of adaptation, of using every advantage you have, including the terrain, to achieve your objectives.
So, to wrap up our deep dive here on Clausewitz and terrain, it's clear that this isn't just some academic exercise. It's about understanding how the very ground you fight on can fundamentally change the way you wage war, even in the 21st century.
Absolutely, and that's what's so amazing about Clausewitz. His work, it goes beyond just military strategy. It offers valuable lessons for anyone who's facing a challenge, a complex situation where they need to adapt, where they need to make those tough decisions with limited information.
Because life, just like warfare, rarely unfolds on a perfectly flat battlefield.
That's the truth.
So that's it for our look at Clausewitz and his timeless insights on terrain and warfare. Until next time, everybody, keep those maps handy and never underestimate the ground beneath your feet.